for downloading this episode of Cork Talk with me, Tim Atkin. A weekly conversation with some of the most famous people in the world of wine. Davies is a master of wine who also specialises in spirits. Originally a top sommelier at restaurants like Zuma and The Ledbury, she moved into retailing at Selfridges and is now buying director at Speciality Drinks and the Whisky Exchange. An extrovert and a people person, she has well-informed views about things as varied as wine service, restaurant lists, Mezcal, blind tasting technique, and champagne. She's one of a kind. Hello, Dawn, and welcome to the podcast.
Hello, Tim. How are you? Thank you for having me.
It's wonderful to have you on the podcast. Where are you right now? I mean, somewhere glamorous in the world, Barbados?
Oh, absolutely. I wish. I'm actually in the glamorous Park Royal, the largest industrial estate in Europe. I mean, how exciting is that?
Yeah, I mean, people have died in there and no one's noticed, haven't they?
A lot.
Listen, we've got so much to talk about because you're both a spirits expert and a wine expert and master of wine. So we'll try and cover a bit of everything in the 40 minutes. But Let's begin with you. You grew up in the States, a few other places, but you're a Brit, aren't you? You were actually born in England, but grew up all over the world. Citizen of nowhere, in a way, as Theresa May would call you.
Absolutely. You know, I always say when people say, where are you from? Because, I mean, I'm probably sure right now I sound like Lloyd Grossman, which is normally what I sound like when I've been recorded. But, you know, I always say that I'm international. I don't feel I'm British. I don't feel like I'm American. I mean, I grew up in Kenya. I grew up in Rome. And we've always traveled. And I think that's partly what's sort of always driven my passion for flavor and, you know, everything in the world that you can taste and smell and touch.
So was your dad in the Foreign Office or something, or what was he doing, or was it?
No, he worked for the UN, the World Bank, UNDP, ADB, FAO, all of the acronyms you can think of in the world, but basically aid agencies. And he was Chief of Compensation and Benefits, which is hysterical because I can't do maths, which for a buyer is fabulous.
That's terrible.
But, you know, he always used to say he's a mathematician, you know, like that was his thing as an economist. And he always gives me so much grief for like always never being able to add 2 + 2 or 3 + 3. And I'm so different to him.
I know, I mean, you learnt a lot from your dad. You were very close, weren't you?
Yeah.
You know, wine especially. I think when you were living in Rome, was your dad giving you a bit of wine to try? And how old were you then? Was it, you know, we shouldn't tell us, but...
Well... well, I probably shouldn't tell this story, but I probably will. So when my father and mother left Africa, and I was about 3 years old then, they had like a going away party. And I think my parents should have known then that I was going to be a problem because I literally toddled round the room and mind swept all the glasses. So I think at that point they knew that they were in for a rough ride. But yeah, I think, you know, like what I loved about Europe and, you know, how my parents sort of brought me up was never to be afraid of flavour and to really, you know, like my father always used to give me a glass of wine with water. You know, you always had water with the wine. And so when I got to like 16, 17, when people were starting to experiment with drink, I was just a bit like, well, there's nothing special here. I've had this before.
Been there, done that.
Yeah, been there, done that. And I think, you know, like my father, when I started working in the industry, was always like, you're a glorified waitress. It didn't matter what I did. And I was like, but it's your fault.
I mean, were they foodies, your parents? So they sound like it. They sound like bohemians in a way, were they?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I always think my father was quite bohemian. My mother's very, very English. She's like an English rose. She's amazing. She's 80 now and she looks like no wrinkles, no nothing. She's incredibly beautiful. And my father was always a bit more kind of out there and a bit more kind of wild and very outgoing, but they love food. You know, my mom cooked a lot at home when she was growing up. Her mother used to never let her in the kitchen. So she'd go in the kitchen, lock the door and like cook because she just wanted to cook. And she's always been someone that's kind of gone out and, you know, like I had to eat everything. I had to taste it once. You know, there was always that in our household. And I think that's kind of stayed with me growing up that, you know, like I wasn't afraid of tasting anything and I didn't like it, but I always tried it.
I love that. I mean, you went to Edinburgh University and you studied social anthropology. I mean, why? Can you tell us?
I still don't know. I think because I just wanted, so my choices of university was quite, I didn't really know what I wanted to do. I wanted to be an actress. So I sort of went down that route for half of my university choices. And then I went to anthropology because I thought that just sounded quite exciting. didn't really know what anthropology was. And then I didn't really visit any universities. I don't think I visited any. I can't even remember why. I just didn't. And I chose Edinburgh because it had a really good male to female ratio.
And what more blokes?
I grew up in an all-girls school. Like by that point, I was just over any women ever. So I think, I went to Edinburgh and it sounded great. And my parents drove me up there and I'd never been to Edinburgh. And I'm a city girl. I've grown up in major cities all over the world, and they were driving me up through the borders. And apparently I had this look of absolute panic on my face because I was like, where are you taking me?
You go to the Highlands.
Yes. And then the relief on my face when we pulled into the bright lights of Edinburgh was incredible. But I loved anthropology, and I love people, and social anthropology is very much about the study of people and culture. And I'd always grown up all over the world, so that was kind of something that was really fascinating for me. And actually, it's probably stood me in good stead.
Yeah. I mean, probably the perfect degree for you in a way. I mean, I've read somewhere that you thought you might become a paleontologist or an aid worker or an actress. So there were lots of careers going on, these different paths, right? And then you got a job in a bar. And what was the bar called?
It was called the Brunsfield Hotel, and it was the King's Bar. And I sort of walked in. I mean, my father basically said to me, I'll pay for your university, I'll pay for your lodging and your basics, but I'm not paying for your Guinness habit. And so I had to go, if I wanted to go drinking, I had to earn the money. And if I wanted to go traveling, I had to earn the money. And that was my father's rule. You learn to earn your own cash. And so I walked into this bar. I decided I wanted to be a barmaid. I was like, yeah, this is me all over. Yeah, I can do this. How hard can it be to pull a pint? And I walked into this bar, and this was a gentleman called Ian Henderson, who I believe still is in the bar. And he's incredible. He was definitely the first person that really kind of got me tasting whiskey and, just got me kind of interested in the drink. But I loved working there because we had all these crazy people who used to come every day and every week, and you'd have your regulars, and then you'd have, because it was a hotel, you'd have all the hotel guests, and I just loved it. And I ended up working there pretty much 5 days a week. Oh, did you? and not doing any university. Yeah,
and you found your milieu really, hospitality. And you're 100%. An extrovert, you love people, you're fun to be around. So I suppose that's what appealed, wasn't it? I mean, you found the booze as well, but it was more being around people and just engaging with people maybe?
Yeah, 100%. I loved it. And I just loved the different flavours you found. I loved the people and actually introducing them to something that they'd never tried before, and especially when you had the Americans in and you gave them the first pint of Cali, Duker's IPA, and they were like,
Iron Brew.
This? Or Iron Brew. And I think it was that kind of personal connection, and I just loved it. I still love it today.
I mean, you did that for a year, didn't you? Then you went, after post-uni, I think, then you went on a world tour. Just where did you go and how did you support yourself? Any wine places on stops on the way?
Actually, weirdly, it was probably the moment where I realised wine had to be in my life. We went, we did the usual. We, started in Asia, whereas in Singapore, we were in Hong Kong, Bangkok, Indonesia, Bali, and then around, of course, to Australia to earn some cash. I was working in bars and stuff, but it was, I went to this restaurant called Tetsuya Wakuda's in Sydney. And Tetsuya, to this day, I can remember every single dish I ate. And I actually was like, this is incredible, because this sommelier came up to me and was like, well, do you want to do the wine and food pairing? And I was like, why not? In for a penny, in for a pound. If I'm going to be broke, I might as well be broke properly. And this guy was fantastic. And I just remember being like, oh my God, I need to do this. So actually, I stopped traveling early and I flew back to the UK. And I applied to Mew because Tex was opening in London. And I walked in, and Michael Dorr, who was my manager, or to be my manager, said to me, what experience do you have? I said, well, worked in bars. I can pull a plate, because any fine dining experience, I was like, I can carry a plate. Yeah, not much. And he was just like, I have no work for you. I said, but I want to learn and I'm going to be good at this. And he called me back a month later and said, I just can't believe how passionate you were and the fact that you were desperate to work for us. have a job. And, I started as a waitress, and the rest is history. So, travel's responsible for where I am today, I guess.
And you didn't start as a sommelier, then you started as a waitress, but then pretty soon they made you a sommelier and you started learning. I mean, were there role models at the time? Were there female sommeliers? It was still pretty French, wasn't it, UK at that time?
So everyone always says to me, did you have a problem as a woman growing up in the industry? And there was only 5 female sommeliers when I started, including myself. So the person I learned from, actually, I was very, very lucky, was a girl called Nabuka Okamura, Irish, Japanese, incredible palate. And she actually, as I was waitressing, she just kind of was like, I noticed you have quite a good palate. So she started teaching me, and I did WSET. And she took me to Zuma with her because she went to open Zuma. And, she actually left to go to Australia. And I was the only person that knew the wine list because I built it with her. And so they said, do you want to be head sommelier? And I was like, yeah, no idea what I'm doing. And that's pretty much been my career since then. I have no idea what I'm doing, but I've just fallen into jobs. Yeah.
But I mean, there were a few other female sommeliers. I mean, Kate Tal was around, and Joël Marty was around, and Nabuka. It was kind of 4 of you. Who was the 5th? Can you remember?
So Helena Hell, who was,
of course,
and then Sylvia Garati came, and we were sort of growing and growing, and even though there's not a lot of women, actually, I never really had problems to be a woman.
Yeah.
I had more problems that I wasn't French.
Yeah. But you are not French.
But you are not French. And, I worked with some incredible French sommeliers, don't get me wrong. Christelle Lalonde was one of my managers at one time at the Square. But it was just such an amazing time to be in wine then, because, we were so lucky. We were tasting some of the best Burgundies, the best Bordeauxs, and people were still affording them. So I really learned what wine was by tasting the classics. And I think that's what a lot of people don't get today in this industry. The new classics aren't classics. They're so different.
Yeah, I think we all did. I mean, I'm a bit older than you. I'm much older than you, but
just a bit.
Just a bit. But I remember the same thing. In the 90s, you could afford to buy, Roumier and Rousseau and I remember buying Grange, Penfolds Grange in Obbins for about 25 quid or something. I mean, okay, it was a lot of money compared with what we were earning, but it was still affordable. Whereas now these things have just become crazy. But tell us, so you went on to some amazing places. You mentioned Zuma. You went to the Boxwood Cafe. You went to the Square and the Ledbury, where you became really famous. They're all very different restaurants, and you're kind of gaining in Michelin stars. How did you go about building a list to suit each of them?
Do I think that was what was so great about the restaurants I worked in. If I started with Zuma was all about Asian cuisine. And I think at the time, lists in London were very, very classic. And I was so lucky to be able to, in that time, to build a list full of Austrian wine, German wines, New World wines. We probably had some of the more kind of, I would say, adventurous of that time wine list. And of course, we were playing around with sake. We had the biggest sake list in Europe for a while. So I think Zuma taught me the kind of left field stuff, the stuff that wasn't, and the kind of classics. And when I went to Boxwood was very much about a very condensed list, but with some really great, but still fun stuff. Boxwood was still very playful. It was kind of, I guess, the take on a modern gastro now. And, working with, of course, Ronan Saburn to help me do the list. And that was great because there was this balance kind of where Zuma was and then where kind of the more kind of classic restaurants were. And then when I got the job at the Ledbury, I went to the Square for a year because the Ledbury wasn't ready. And Nigel said to me, I'm sending you to the Square because you know nothing about the classics. And he was right. So, the Ledbury was probably the kind of pinnacle of wineness in the terms for me, not the world, but we had this amazing access there. I mean, Nigel Platts-Martin, one of the best collectors of wine for restaurants in the world. For me, one of the greatest restaurateurs in the world and probably one of the least known, and just had this eye for great wine and cellared it. And so, we were really learning, we were pouring 95, 96, 90, 94s, 95s, Burgundies, when everyone else was on sort of more 2000, 2001, because Nigel had cellared. And I think that what was why it was so exciting was just to kind of, I think, learning the classics, but yet still having that really modern take on things. So very much, I was always one of the kind of the first proponents of Austrian wine, of Portuguese wines. And, I was definitely not afraid to go left field.
Yeah.
But I think, it was kind of almost a progression. It went from starting very left field, going to kind of very classic, and then kind of finding the balance. And I think that reflected what Brett was doing in the kitchen at the Ledbury. He was mixing those classics with that Australian kind of humor and joy for food. And I think it was, for me, it was very much also about the customer. Our customers were not the square customers. The square customers were very kind of set in their kind of palates, and they liked a certain style, whereas the Ledbury consumer was a little bit more edgy. They were wanting to have a bit more fun and play. And I think whenever you build a list, it's about, okay, of course, what suits the food, but also you don't necessarily pair food with people, or with people all the time. You pair wine with people. And I think for me, that was one of the things I did that was maybe different as a sommelier. I wasn't.
That's interesting. Yeah. So you looked at the person and thought, okay, what are they going to like?
Yeah. Yeah. I always used to, when I used to train my sommeliers, and when I've trained people since, I always say, the sommelier is a psychologist. You have to have assessed, diagnosed, and given the medicine in 30 seconds of meeting that person. And I think that was kind of the way I looked at it. I didn't necessarily think, I'm going to give you this because you should have it, because it goes with your steak. If they wanted a Sauvignon Blanc with their steak, well, then I'd give them a really big, juicy Sauvignon Blanc to go with their steak. So it was about listening to people. And I was just quite different in the industry. I had this Americanism that was like, please the customer.
Gosh, how revolutionary!
I was just very different.
What was the funniest thing that happened to you when you were doing that job? When you were on the floor, you were.
Oh my God, so many things, so many. I mean, I should. Do you know what? I should have written everything down and written a book, because you have these memories that kind of come up to you all the time. But I think a couple of sort of wine stories that I love. Well, one was not a wine story. One, I was actually not even in service, and I had come in early because the receptionist had called in sick, and I was the restaurant manager at the time. And it was a beautiful day, so I took my chair outside. I was having like a glass of water or something. This wonderful old gentleman, beautiful old gentleman, came up to me. And he was like, we just started chatting. 45 minutes we talked for. And then he suddenly was like, oh my God, I've got to go. I said, look, you must come to the restaurant at some time. Just book with me. It's not a problem. Just call. And I said, tell me your name before you go so I know when you call. He goes, oh, I'm Vidal. And I was like, okay. And surname, sir? And he goes, Sassoon. I was like, I have your shampoo. And, we were so lucky to have some of these amazing people. And I'll never forget, Sylvia will kill me for telling the story, but Sylvia Garatti, who's absolutely fantastic, one of the best sommeliers I worked with, came down to the office one day in lunchtime, and I hadn't been on the floor because it was very quiet. And she was so upset. And I was like, oh my God, what's happened? She goes, oh my God, this customer's just been so rude to me. He's told me that port isn't made in Portugal. And I was like, okay, fine. Let me go up and deal with this man. And, there is the rule that the customer's always right, but in certain instances, they're just not. And I went up to him and I said, sir, I hear you've got a problem with my sommelier. And he's like, yes, she tried to tell me that port is made in Portugal. Everyone knows it's made in Spain. And I said, sir, the clue is in the title. And? And it was just moments like that. I think restaurants, customers are incredible. They can give you the worst night of your life or the best night of your life.
So you moved on from there. You went to Selfridges, didn't you, as head wine and spirits buyer? That job was a bit of a revolving door for a while, isn't it? People tended to do it for a while and move on pretty quickly. Was it easy to transfer the skills you'd learnt doing on the floor as a sommelier to retail?
Do you know what? It was really interesting. Do you know the biggest issue I had? It was in the first... I'd been working 90 hours a week in the Ledbury, just to give you an idea of kind of, it was, you'd go in at 9 a.m, you'd finish at 2:00 in the morning. And, that was constant, like 6-7 days a week. And I got to Selfridges, and I remember for the first 3 months, I went mental. I was like, I have evenings off. I must go out. And it was actually that culture was the hardest thing. And I think, it was also understanding, I shouldn't tell this, but I'm going to. I had a meeting with Moet Hennessy, LVMH, and it was Ewan Ventners, who was my boss at the time, who was food director at Selfridges, the assistant buyer for Selfridges, and the guys from the LVMH. And I was like, and they were just a little bit, what are you going to do for us? And I turned around and I said, well, I don't have to do anything for you. I could delist you tomorrow, having no clue what the worth of all of LVMH products were to Selfridges. But in a funny way, it was so ballsy that we ended up having an incredible relationship with them as a partnership. But it was just because I had no clue. So I think it was that kind of getting inside. You were no longer just buying for yourself. You were, and what you wanted for that restaurant. You had to buy product that maybe weren't your favorite products.
Yeah.
Because the consumer liked them, so you had to buy gold and sparkly things because Selfridges customer in Manchester loves gold and sparkly, and that's fine. So, but I think also I brought a lot from the floor to Selfridges,
including
the diversity,
a bit of attitude,
the interest, the attitude, and actually that sense of service. For me, it was the guys on the floor and the team were brilliant, but it was service, and I loved it. I mean, Selfridges was an incredible time in my life.
I mean, Selfridges gave the chance to learn about spirits, didn't it? I mean, you knew a bit about it, but in fact, you're one of the very few, maybe the only master of wine who straddles both worlds. We're sort of,
Liz, I would say there's a couple of us, but
with equal levels of expertise. I mean, just tell us what spirits and wine have in common. What sets them apart? I mean, obviously they're made from different things, but I mean, do they have things like terroir in common?
I think it's really interesting. I think actually what I find with both, I mean, if you like great flavor, it doesn't matter whether it's a high ABV or a low ABV. It's still great flavor and great history and great culture and great people. I think that's what they have in common. They have the sense of people that are making things with passion and love from a base product. And I always say spirits don't have terroir. There are a few spirits that have terroir. There are things like agave. There's some sugarcane juice-based spirits. And now we're starting to see a little bit more of those kind of whiskies having that. But
maybe Islay malts, do you think, with sort of peaty? Is that terroir?
A little, but maybe the peat doesn't necessarily come from Islay. It can come from other places. So, I think that's what's quite interesting about spirits. It has a sense of place more so than it does terroir, which is what I always talk about with spirits. I think, for me, terroir is, and as an MW, that you have to be able to taste where it's from in the glass. Now, I might be able to taste the distillery or identify the distillery, but I can't taste where the barley's from, because often the barley comes from Eastern Europe, not from Scotland or whatever. And there are people in the industry that are changing that. But I think for me, it's actually a lot of the process before it gets into the still is very similar. So fermentation, the importance of yeast, the water, base product,
quality of the water,
and then when it goes into oak's giving the same things. It's giving oxygen, it's giving flavor as it does to wine. So I think there's definitely a synergy. I think I actually think wine is harder than spirits. I think spirits is actually easier in a funny way to learn. I'm not going to tell you I'm an expert on stills or anything like that, but I think once you have a basis in one, it is transferable over to the other. I think and interestingly enough, one of my wine suppliers, actually, I was tasting with him the other day, and he turned around and goes, I think you've got a better palate now you're a spirits taster.
Oh, that's interesting, because it's a completely different world in a way, isn't it?
Yeah, and you're getting so many flavours, so you're pulling flavours that are different, which actually are also relevant. So
interesting.
It's been really, really interesting.
I mean, I think people who don't know much about spirits, and that includes me, obviously, always assume that whiskey, with or without an E, but particularly without an E, the Scottish bit, is the most complex spirit. I mean, I know you got a soft spot for rum and for tequila / mezcal. Can you explain a little bit? I mean, is whiskey the most complex spirit, or is that rubbish?
I don't think so. I think actually wine for me is far more complex than any spirit. But I do think, whiskey, now there are so many distilleries all around the world. I think that's where it's harder to get. And there's a lot of complexity with probably the stills and things. But it's taking a base product, it's fermenting it, it's distilling it, and then it's aging it. I think it's more probably the knowledge of how they've changed over the years, but no different. Wine's changed over the years. Burgundy from the 96 isn't the same as 2006. And like whiskey from the 1960s is very different to today, even if it's the same distillery, because process changes, product changes, If
consumers
we look at champagne,
change, right?
Consumers change, I think, but we look at it, we can say the same thing for wine. If you look at champagne, originally a lot of the champagnes were aged in casks. Then it kind of stainless steel became trendy because it was cleaner and more popular. And now we're going back to more oak-led champagne. So I don't think, I think whiskey, it's the amount of distilleries, it's the amount of different flavors, it's the amount of things you can use. So whether it's barley, whether it's grain, whether it's corn, whether it's wheat, whether,
rye or whatever.
All of the rye, it gives you different flavors. But that's no different than Cabernet Sauvignon versus Sauvignon.
Those are your grape varieties in a way, aren't they? Tell us about tasting, because I always find tasting spirits tiring. I mean, partly because you've got 40% alcohol or more sometimes, where, wine I can taste comfortably, sort of 80 wines in a day. Yeah. I couldn't imagine tasting 80 spirits. I mean, do you?
No, I would never taste more than 60. And I think 60 is a lot. So when we're judging, I judge on wine tastings and I judge on spirits. So with wine, we would never taste, as you said, more than 80 really in a day. Spirits, we would try not to taste more than 60 because the alcohol essentially flattens your palate in the same way that tannin would flatten your palate in wine. And it tires you out. And no matter how much you spit, you're still going to imbibe. So, when you're tasting cask strength and when you're tasting high ABV, it tires your palate a lot quicker than it would do at a sort of 15, say, % wine.
Alcohol or something, wine,
So, I
think you cut them with water or not? Is that allowed?
Yes, you can. So when I judge, I head up the whiskey judging for IWSC with Richard Patterson, and we taste very differently. So Richard Patterson, master blender for Dalmore, very famous personality in the industry, and he's a blender, so he always cuts to 20%. Whereas I taste as the consumer would taste it and judge in that respect. I might add a bit of water to see how it balances out or if it helps it, because sometimes adding water helps, sometimes it hinders. Often it shows the imperfections in the spirit, so I understand why they do it. So there's no kind of rules on
Okay. It's not frowned on to cut it with water, right?
No. I think I always say you drink how you want to drink. If you want to. I remember having one of my favorite customers in the Boxwood was the wonderful gentleman who you may know called Albert Finney, who very famous movie star.
The Albert Finney.
The Albert Finney. He used to come in and he used to order this certain bottle of wine. And every time I used to be like, you sure you want that one? You sure you don't want something a bit cheaper? What he would do, he would order Grand Cru Burgundy and then mix it with soda. And he used to be like, Dawn, but this is the way I enjoy it. And I was like, you know what? You do you. If it makes you happy, you drink it how you want to drink it.
Let's talk a bit about the MW, the Master of Wine. What made you want to do it, first of all? Like a challenge?
Do you know what? I'm one of these lazy people. I need to push myself to learn. So I need to always, have something to make myself learn. And, I think I was really kind of quite confident in my knowledge of, say, the producers or the styles of wine and how to taste. But what I didn't have was the knowledge on how it got into my glass and, the theory behind wine. And I just remember... I don't even remember who it was that kind of I started talking to about the Master of Wine, but I just remember thinking, if you're going to do something, do it properly. And I could have done the Master Sommelier, but there was no way I was going to pass that because I'm not great at service and wine would have gone everywhere and I would never pass that bit of it. But actually in a funny way, I felt that they're very different. They're very equally hard. They're both as challenging as one another, but I think I felt more comfortable with the tasting side of it and the identifying side of it than I did with the theory. Rather
than pouring into people into small glasses or something.
Yeah. And so I thought, let's do it. And on reflection, it was the hardest thing I've ever done in my life.
What advice would you give to somebody doing it now? Funnily enough, I was talking to somebody, Mary, who's the winemaker at Gusbourne, who's going to be on the podcast in a couple of months' time, and she's about to start doing it. She said, "What advice would you give someone?" I said, "Start with exam papers. Work out exactly what it is they're going to want to know. Don't think I need to know everything. Start with what you actually need to know." What would your advice be to somebody starting with doing it now?
I mean, I think I was a bit stupid in the first place. So I'd never done diploma. No one's really sure how I got onto the MW without doing diploma. But I'd never written an essay since I left university. We're talking 20. I was like, and it was you and David Leave that actually were like, just stop writing so much. And David was like, read The Economist. That's what you need to. And you were like a page and a half. And, and I think it was just that and dry tasting notes, writing dry tasting notes.
Yeah. Yeah.
It's not about how good you are as a taster. I know I'm a good taster, but I couldn't pass the tasting because I didn't know how they wanted me to think on paper. And dry tasting notes gave me that. It was just very regimented. It was like, this is what they need to put on the paper. And I think you're right. It's less is more sometimes with the MW.
Yeah.
And
I like dry tasting. So dry tasting note is a tasting note without any wine, basically. Just in case people are wondering.
And it's just writing what you think should be in the glass. But I would say my biggest piece of advice would be, you're going to fail. You're going to cry, but keep going.
I didn't.
Yeah, it was easier when you passed.
Yeah. So long ago. Right. 2015, you joined Speciality Drinks as buying director, which is where you are now in the glamorous Park Royal.
Yeah.
You seem to do so many things. I mean, what does your job entail? You're buying, obviously, but you're also running events. You're running a team. You're teaching people. How do your days pan out?
I'm basically the general dog's body for the Speciality Drinks, so the Whisky Exchange. I would say the big proportion, of course, is doing the buying for the Whisky Exchange and Speciality. But I think what we do incredibly well as a company is education and engagement, and the shows are a huge part of that. So we have currently 4 shows.
Whiskey, and we're going to have 6. Rum. Champagne?
We've got Whisky Show, which is our big bad boy in October. We have Champagne Show, which is this week. So that's November. We have Cognac Show. We have Rum Show. And then I'm adding 2 shows next year. I'm adding a Welcome to Whisky Show to get people into the category, because I think that's really, really important. And Tequila and Mezcal, because we need some agave in our lives. So, the events are so important in that kind of journey into drinks, not even just spirits, but wine. So we did Wine Month last year as well. And also our retail spaces. So I also run the shops. We have 3 shops. And for me, there's that connection with the consumer. I think the best buyers in the world are the buyers that understand who they're buying for and don't sit in their ivory towers. So I work the whole of December in the shops because I want to know my customers. The events give me that. The shops gives me that. You have to understand the consumer, and especially when you're working for an e-commerce platform where you don't actually see your consumer very often. Yeah. Getting out there and really understanding that customer gives you such a sense.
And that's the sommelier thing again, really, isn't it? Where you're being a psychologist, you're being a 30-second psychologist in a way. You're still doing that with what you're doing now. I mean, as you said, you're spending time talking to people. Favorite wine stars, and I'm guessing it's champagne, because I think you need to tell us about the champagne bathrobe and the director's chair. Remember that there might be children listening to this podcast, so I think just keep it clean.
So about 3 years ago, over COVID, one of my best friends and I, a gentleman called Mitch Wilson, who is the ambassador for a rum called Black Tot. And Black Tot is basically a rum that was celebrating the last day that the Navy could drink rum. And it was known as Black Tot Day. And this, bearing in mind, this is only about 50-something years ago, so you could still be in charge of a nuclear submarine and have a tot of rum. Yeah, precisely. So we did Black Tot 24 hours, and we stayed up for 24 hours and did talks and tastings online as around the globe as the night went on. About rum. But I love champagne, and Mitch loves champagne, but he's love sugarcane. So we just started this whole thing, and it was over COVID. We were super bored. I was drinking more champagne than I've ever drunk in my entire life, because all the brands had no one else to give it to. So they were giving it to the only person who seemed to be working. And so we were called Sugarcane and Champagne. And because we were doing this Black Top 24 Hours, and Mitch and I are incredibly childlike and silly, we decided we needed directors' chairs that had sugarcane and champagne on it. And then, of course, Mitch and I went one step further and we're like, well, we're staying up till the morning. We've got to have bathrobes with sugarcane and champagne on it. So, yeah, I mean, I love champagne.
I love it. I've got to ask you this. I mean, I hope it's not regarded as a bit of a cliche, but, you've had this very successful career. What advice would you give young women who want to achieve what you've achieved? I mean, is it easier now than when you started out in 2002? Has the wine business and the spirits business got a bit more, I don't know, is it more open to women than it was then?
Oh, I mean, 100%. 100%. I think, as a woman, yes, of course there's still challenges. But I think we have to remember this industry, 99% of the people that we deal with are people that want you in this industry, want to teach you, that give you time. I have had more men, you included, mentor me through my life, and I am hugely grateful for that. And I think, yes, of course, there are people that aren't going to be, helpful or are going to be inappropriate and things like that. But you have to stay strong in yourself. You have to know your own worth, which I think is actually probably the biggest issue I've ever had, is the pay gap and the gender pay gap. That is the one thing that's been a part of my life since I joined the industry. But you have to be able to work. Nothing is going to be given to anyone on a plate. Mm. And that goes for a male or a female or anyone trying to get into this industry. You have to be prepared to put the hours in. You have to be able to be passionate. You have to be able to learn, and I think my advice to anyone is that I still work 60 hours a week, and I still insanely passionate about what I do. And I've worked to get where I am today. Yes, I was lucky. I fell into the right jobs, the right places. But the people that have given me their time are the people that are responsible for who I am today as much as I am. So go out there, learn and ask questions and talk to people. It's not just about what you know. It's actually a lot about who you know and the people that are willing to back you. And I think for any woman or man coming into the industry, don't sit on your laurels. Don't think stuff's going to come to you just because of your gender. You've got to work. It doesn't matter who you are.
I always think that the other thing is that to listen to people who know more than you do, but have confidence in your own taste and your own ideas. So don't just parrot what other people say, because very often you find, I found this even when I was young, sometimes you'd think, oh God, I'm sure I've got this wrong. And you find out you're the only in a room full of people, especially knowing much more than you, who's got the right answer, in a blind tasting or something, and I'm not saying that makes me exceptional in any way at all. I've got the wrong answer lots of times. But I think having confidence in yourself in a way, not arrogance, but having a bit of self-confidence is no bad thing. Last thing I'm going to ask you is about, you once described yourself as the dictionary definition of a workaholic. You were only working 60 hours a week now. It was 90 when you were at the Ledbury. I mean, how do you switch off, man? I mean, I know you like dancing because I've seen you dancing. I won't say where, but I've seen you dancing. How do you get away from wine, Dawn?
Do you know what? I love people. Yes, it's still about wine, but I love going out for dinner. I love meeting my friends. I'm insanely sociable and probably one of the most sociable people on the planet. But at the same time, I love watching like terrible TV or cooking at home. I cook a lot, and that's kind of my real off. I read a hell of a lot, and it's all trashy kind of murder mystery novels. But I love rugby. I watch rugby, and I guess it's, for me, actually, I don't ever really switch off. I'm not going to lie, but when I do, it's more about I love traveling, but this is my passion. This is my life. This is something that inspires me every day. I live it. I breathe it. I am it, I think Fiona Sims used to call me the wine wench back in the day.
Well, I probably can't call you that, but I just know.
You've called me worse.
With my friend Dawn. Listen, it's been brilliant talking to you. I love what you do. I mean, everything you said is true. You're one of the kindest, most passionate people I know. You're brilliant at what you do, and you've straddled this amazing world where you know as much about spirits as you do about wine. I mean, it's hard enough keeping up with wine, never mind spirits as well. I'm going to see you very soon. In fact, I'm going to see you next Friday, I think, at an event through Wine Men in London. I hope we can have dinner very soon because it's always fun. We drink great wines, and I always start too late with you. That's the problem.
That's my job.
Exactly. Okay, Dawn, see you soon, my friend.
Love you loads.
Well, I knew Dawn would be a lot of fun to interview, and she didn't let me down. Next week on Cork Talk, my guest is the wine writer and social media sensation, Tom Gilby. Join me then. Thanks for listening to Cork Talk. If you want to read more reports, articles and tasting notes by me, go to my website, timatkin.com. You can also follow me on Twitter @TimAtkin and on Instagram @TimAtkinMW. See you next week.